Hello to all the viewers out there. Thanks so much for watching. This is the 21st Reaction, and today I'm very glad to bring on Mr. Geocon, the geoconservative. And today we're going to talk a little bit about monarchy versus democracy, some of the historical applications of each system, what the incentives are, pros and cons, all of that good stuff. Personally, of course, it's not going to be a fair fight. On this channel, it's going to be very pro monarchy, anti democracy. Some boomers and normie people like to say, a common parlance, that, democracy is the best, is the worst system except for all the other systems. It has some flaws, but, it's the best we've got. When I would say the opposite, I would say that it's actually probably the worst form of government that could possibly exist, and the reverse of that, that monarchy would probably be the best of the worst. But that's just my opinion. I'm sure Geocon might have a more moderate approach on these issues. But hello, glad to have you on. How are
I
you doing?
probably I probably do have a moderate opinion, and I'm glad to be on 21st. You mind if I call you 21st, or
Oh yeah, I'm sure
what would you prefer I call it?
that should be easy. 21st should be fine.
Well, if I may, my opinion on things is that modern democracy in the form that we have now, and democracy in general, I find is something of it's it's functional. That's one good thing about it. But it's not. But I think it's we're fast approaching the limits of what we would consider to be modern liberal democracy. At this, one could say that 2020 we're entering into late stage democracy, and and I think that this kind of how should I put it? This situation has left me quite skeptical of democracy and open to newer ideas about how to govern society. Uh, I'm not committed to any kind of positive vision of what should replace modern democracy, though. I'd have to see it for myself.
Well, I would definitely agree with the idea that we're in late stage democracy, but personally, I think that happened a while ago. It's starting to accumulate. The ball was rolling, but now the snowball is getting pretty big down that mountain. It might start an avalanche. That's very unfortunate, but we'll see. We'll see. We'll
I
see. Yeah, we'll see if I can try and sell you on some
I
points.
mean, honestly, everything that we're seeing now is what liberal democracies have been producing for the past couple of hundred years. It's just that it seems to be just getting worse because of the advent of postmodernity and the internet being as it is.
Oh yeah, the internet is it started out almost with this kind of anarchic quality to it. And of course, right now they're starting to try and centralize and organize it into something that's mainstream and curated like television. But I just don't think it's possible. So we might be seeing the farther polarization and diversification of all kinds of ideas. Perhaps a Pandora's box of ideas that won't be able to stop. But we'll see. We'll see.
Mm.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
mean, yeah.
I'm actually skeptical that the internet can bring about that kind of decentralization. I think ultra centralization is inevitable in some way.
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
we'll see about that. But I do think that we are just basically getting the same results that we've gotten for quite a while. Like you said, even hundreds of years, perhaps. It's just each iteration gets a bit more heated. We could say like right now, what happened this summer might have been similar to 1960s, late 1960s movements in protests, but it just appears a bit more aggressive now, or maybe the 1992 riots. But we'll see about that. I'm sure personally, I'm sure the answer will be very clear to you over the coming years. but I hope not. But I think it will be pretty clear. So I just wanted to start with possibly some basic pros and cons of monarchy versus democracy. So as you can see, one of the first things I put was pro for monarchy is that it's ordering and it formalizes the government in a way that it's quite clear in any real monarchy, if it's not kind of an Elizabethan fake monarchy where they're just a placeholder. Uh, the leader is quite clearly out at the front. They are ruling. You know who rules you, and it's ordered into a very clear hierarchy that way. So usually that's a benefit to people when they're governed if they know who's governing them, right?
I would say so. Yeah, it's generally a good thing for the people themselves to be governed by people that they know are governing, because I think one of the things that we'll talk about with democracy, its main quality is that it is the leaders of democracy are very self-effacing.
Yeah, I mean that's got the kind
Uh,
of the basic idea of it is that well, you're not necessarily being governed if you're choosing who governs you. It's this kind of circular thing. So that might be a reason why they're so self-effacing about that.
hmm, yeah, I mean, if there's anything that says that makes very clear who's governing you, it's a monarchy. That's the form of government that's the most official, formalized. Um, so you also put here that there's a long term government policy.
Yeah. So what I would say there is that, for example, in democracies, you're going to have a supposed change of administration every few years or every certain time period. But when you have a clear monarchy and their court and all that stuff, or even like in China where Xi Jinping is clearly the ruler there, the absolute leader, they're capable of actually planning long-term policies and strategies based on their framework, their worldview, and that can actually be executed in the real world. Unlike unlike our liberal democracies, where someone could try out a policy and they don't get to see how it works because it immediately gets subverted or repealed 5 years down the road. So you're kind of going in these short-term policies, and it's somewhat blind.
Hmm. I think that if I wanted to push back on that, I could say that a lot of the non-democratically elected leaders in a democracy, they tend to informally come up with plans that get implemented years down the road, and I think that they can, and I think through I think these informal leaders of the democracy can affect long-term policy in such a way.
Ah, you see.
But
Huh. No, no, sorry, I interrupted. Go on.
Well, I mean, the you're right about the formal leaders of a democracy, you know, the back and forth of between political parties. But when it comes to informal leaders like the intellectuals and the media and the kind of and their patrons, they can formulate policy and implement and have it implemented later on down the road. Like for instance, um, we talk about the Schwab plan, commonly known as the Great Reset. That was decades. That was planned out, I think, over a decade ago. So it's not that these people can't. It's not that these people can't plan things out ahead of time. It's just that it's not the actual people we claim to be in who claim to be in charge of the democracy that actually make the long term plans. It's these kinds of informal networks that make these long term plans in a democracy.
Yes, that's interesting. I'd actually completely agree with that, and perhaps um, perhaps that goes in line with and is because democracy as the absolute ideal doesn't really exist. And so eventually, like you referred to earlier, some informal organization will form under the hood and will actually run things. While, like you said, those formal leaders don't really get much of their policies done. I mean, as you can see, like for example, hot you know everyday example is Trump trying to build this wall in America, and he gets half of it done before they snuff him out. But they could easily, just not repair that wall. They could easily poke holes in it, allow people to go through, even take it down in the next 5 years. But the long-term policy dating back to 1965 of steady immigration into the country, that can be maintained because there's several power structures that aren't democratic under the hood that actually want to make sure that happens. You said the media and the intellectuals, of course. I'd also say basically the deep state bureaucracies that exist forever. Um, the alphabet soup organizations that regulate most things and really do most of the execution of policy. So I guess that is a point there because democracy gets very quickly replaced by these people that act behind the scenes.
Well, I mean, I'd argue that the entire purpose of democracy is as it is to have these people act more efficiently behind the scenes. But I think that's a bit down the road. We can get to that when we go to democracy's pros and cons.
Yeah.
Um,
So
so
yeah.
you go. So would you say? So how would you say? But I think that what you have the formalized leader is also the long term planner in a monarchy, which I think is a good idea. I think another way monarchies are able to think longer term is that they're more inclined towards tradition, in the sense that unless unless it's a unless it's a kind of liberalizing monarch, you're or the enlightened despot variety. Most monarchs want to. Uh, Most monarchs have an incentive towards making sure that their people are of good quality. I and I
Yeah.
think that
Yeah.
they're less likely to just make decisions based on what they think is going to make them popular.
Yeah, they're not tied down by the wisping whims of the public at any given moment. Although there does have to be this longer term stability, this maintenance of public satisfaction. But that's generally a lower standard than every day being popular with 90% of people. Um, but also one of the reasons why I would say the long-term planner and they're also going to be traditional is because they're going to be there for that entire time. So if it doesn't pan out, they're going to face the consequences of it. Unfortunately, unlike in a democratic administration where they could switch policy and conceal their failures, or they won't be there when the crap hits the fan. So that's another reason
Hmm.
for them to do that, and because they're going to be there and they have to balance on this very large entity, they probably wouldn't go with any revolutionary or utopian ideas, because they want to make sure it's tried and true. They want it to actually work and be stable for them in their life. Kind of like
Mm.
um, kind of like a person saving for retirement. They're not going to throw all their money into some crazy new asset, but they're just going to do basic retirement savings, and that's what will work for the long term. So tried and true, nothing new. And if you're a conservative, then that's the kind of ethos you'd probably prefer.
I think another. pro of monarchy that I definitely can see is the idea of there being of the kind of strong national unity around the leader, and usually a common culture that's diffused throughout the society.
Right.
Could you maybe you could elaborate on that point?
Well, yeah, yeah. And I don't even think it's necessarily just about monarchy as the government itself. The There's always this aesthetic aspect to the state, and monarchies are I'm a person that really cares about those aesthetics. Monarchy really excels in this sphere because okay, if you're going to have a monarch, the absolute leader and ruler for their entire life, people do get kind of attached to that figure over time, and they will come together around that person, and there develops a basic aesthetic around them. You can see some of the European monarchs have lots of cultural products and artwork, and people surrounding them that develop this aesthetic, and that's what diffuses down to the commoners and to the common culture. Um, yeah, so I mean, anytime you have a leader, you kind of people will kind of revolve around the aesthetics that come from that leader. But unlike a democracy, there's supposed to be no leader. It's just supposed to be the voice of the people. And unfortunately, that doesn't really promote a common culture or a strong national unity, because democracy is the same thing as partisanship. And partisanship is just a soft civil war using words and not swords. So it's kind of the exact opposite, and it's the
You have
worst
a
of that
king.
side.
You have a king that at best is not above politics and is non-political, and at worst could act as someone who could fairly arbitrate between two different sides in should things become political.
Right, exactly. Um, a strong leader in the center is one that could actually extinguish a soft cultural civil war. But in a democracy, the incentives are for that to not end, because you can capitalize on the partisanship in order to galvanize your own supporters and exploit their hatred of their enemy on the other side. So
Well,
there's no one there to bring them together in the middle. Why should they come together?
one thing that I might want to note about democracy and ethnic struggle. So there's one thing I wanted to note about ethnic struggle in democracy. When you see, it's not really, while you do see genocides in the ancient world, the idea of a race-based ethnic genocide really only came about in mass democracy. Because if you think about it, democracy does necessitate a kind of ethnic cleansing on the part of the authorities. The authorities in charge have every incentive to homogenize the populations, is to make sure that everybody's going to be voting in one way, and so
Wait,
they
but there's
have
not one
a
authorities. I understand. There's not one authorities. Wouldn't there be several different partisans, and they have their own coalitions and groups?
they would, but but I would argue. I mean, look at what happened in Yugoslavia when that country broke apart into ethnic conflict. What you find with these kinds of democracies is that the different partisan leaders, the civil, uh, I guess you could say that the Civil War became hot. The Cold Civil War became hot, and when that happened, these people decided, well, I'm not. It's going to be too difficult to democratically govern under one state. So instead, we're going to ethnically cleanse all of the people who I know are not going to vote like us. And you see this to a lesser extent within liberal democracies too. You see this drive to try and suppress the other side as much as possible in order in order to in order to get the most votes. Like you see this in, say, the immigration debate. You know, they would invite foreigners to come in mass and populate your country. And really, while there were certain monarchies that did that, Vortigern comes to mind, for example. Um, they didn't really. They did that mainly to suppress rebellions, and it was really just like weak monarchies that did that. As Machiavelli would have pointed out, if you're relying on mercenaries, you know that your number's up. But when the kind of, how should I put it? Uh, the kind of the kind of democracy that, but it seems as though democracies do this as a matter of course, if that makes sense.
No, that does make sense, but I think it's actually I think you're actually reinforcing my points because the Yugoslavic situation sounds like a cold civil war that eventually turns hot because really these multi-ethnic, multicultural democracies always end up having that problem where in the end either a strongman like in the Soviet Union takes them all together and rules them through force, or they split up like this and turn into patchwork. Um, but I would say that under a monarchy, like you said, other than those weak monarchs in those rare situations, they have an incentive to have a strong common culture and national unity, so that that can revolve around them as the leader itself, and they're the head of that. But in a democracy, if you're a political partisan, for example, maybe a political party, you can benefit from sowing division and giving so-called red meat to your supporters. So eventually, this kind of polarization can go on, like you were saying in Yugoslavia, and it can rip apart in kind of explosive ways. Um, I would probably call the Yugoslav situation late stage democracy, like kind of our situation in 2020. But I think it goes into my point here. It always slides towards totalitarianism over time. Um, every issue of civic life will be an opportunity for partisan power acquisition. And so it either transitions into fascism, which would mean, you know, like ethnic cleansing or something really bad like that, or more likely socialism. So in those situations you're talking about, either they split up or one of the dominant groups rules the pack, might by right, because they have some kind of majority in the territory.
Yeah, and I'd like to add that I once wrote somewhere that the teleological end of the political party in a democracy is the creation of a one party state. Because if you think about the average political party, what is the ideal for the political party? Well, it's to get as many of their members into into elected positions, to insert as many of their members into non-elected positions, and to win the hearts and minds of as many people as possible in order to get these people to their elected positions. And then finally, when they get into power, they fulfill whatever goal that the political party leaders set out for them. So in the end, it becomes a kind of, they're trying to create a one party state, which is not the same thing as a democracy. As a sorry, not a democracy. A one party state is not the same thing as a monarchy, and I think this gets confused by some people when they talk about this, because a lot of people think that monarchy is a form of totalitarianism or fascism. And maybe you could explain the difference between a kind of modern totalitarian government and a monarchy.
Yeah, That's a problem people often have, where they have this myopic 20th, 21st century vision of the world, and they want to project it into every past century and every past historical era, when it should probably be the other way around. Time goes from the past to the future. So fascism was a 20th century movement. Monarchy is a literally 4,000-year-old political tradition. So it's kind of not fair to do that. But on the issue of totalitarianism, it's kind of interesting because um, what is totalitarianism? It's when the state is intervening and cares about every single facet of your life. Now, um, the state doesn't have to do this if they have complete control, and paradoxically, if it's not dependent on your opinion of validating the state. If the state's secure without you liking them, that's actually a reason for them not to be totalitarian. So monarchies aren't based on whether everyone approves of them all the time. They're just based on the fact that that leader actually has power and runs society and is the sovereign. So in that situation, there's no need to be totalitarian if they actually have power. It's kind of ironic because people think of 20th century tin pot dictators and how they're so totalitarian. Well, most of the time, those people were basically at the behest of the international consensus, or the basically the Anglosphere global empire, and they didn't really have much power, and they weren't very secure in their own regimes. But if we go to actually secure monarchs like the Tsars in 19th century Russia, although they do pay attention to people opposing them, or writing slander in the press or anything, they're not tracking what everyone is saying all the time. Kind of, you know, quite different to us in a
Well, I
democracy now,
mean,
where we're
well,
listened to
I
for every
mean,
moment in
I
social media.
well, I'd like to push back on that because um, the 19th century SARS, maybe the earlier SARS, perhaps, but the 19th century SARS were kind of I mean, they're the ones who created the idea of a secret police, and they also, and then you had Tsar Nicholas the First, I believe, who implemented a Russification, where he imposed he made it the law that all of the different that everybody had to speak a Russian and convert to a Russian Orthodoxy within his country, and he imposed this on all of the different ethnic groups in Russia, including the ones that were formerly the allies of the Tsar's family, which angered a lot of these ethnic groups and led to greater tension within society.
Wow, Caesaro
So,
papism gang.
I mean, it's uh, those kinds of, I mean, that kind of thing did happen with uh, monarchs, but I think what you say is generally true about them. I would just add that these kinds of here's another thing I would add to in favor of monarchy. When you have, think about all of the ways that modern day tin pot dictators come to power. It's either through this kind of electioneer. It's either by getting elected and then staying in power through Machiavellian means, or through violent revolution and conquest. And in these environments, not you're number one, you're not going to find a lot of noble people, noble men in being in charge of this. And number two, this is not a stable situation. There's not really like if the dear leader dies, then all these different people will break apart and start fighting each other. And this is true across the and I think this is true throughout history. With anytime you don't have a anytime you don't have a clear successor, and because this happened to monarchs who didn't create clear success lines of succession, like Alexander the Great. He conquered. He conquered this vast territory, and then he said he died young, saying, "Well, I leave my territory to the strongest." And then his generals broke apart his empire.
Right, he's just
So
leaving it to might makes right again, and that's not
yeah,
very
and
stable government.
yeah,
We want strong and
yeah,
stable leadership, please.
yeah, and monarchies generally give that through the kind of primogeniture, or either through primogeniture, or there were these kinds of, or in the past there were these kinds of electoral monarchies where what you would have is, when the king died, there was kind of an election that was held where all the nobility would vote based on the who which of the people who shared the king's blood should take the throne next. And these systems tended to work pretty well, I'd say. When, I mean, another thing that I mean, with primogeniture monarchies, especially, what you can do is you can raise your next ruler, your successor, to however you like, and you can give him a moral upbringing that will allow him to be a moral ruler, which I think is a huge boon that I don't think democracies, or especially totalitarian dictatorships, have. Because I mean, if you look at Hitler and Stalin, neither of them were paragons of moral virtue.
Exactly. I mean, do people really think that Lenin and Mao and perhaps even Pinochet or Batista, do people really think these people that led, kind of revolutions and became dictators, do they really think that they're the same as Frederick the Great, Prussia, that was on a long lineage and had a long tradition of good governance? I just don't understand why people do that. It's this kind of progressive modernist crap or whatever. But I do want to
I
just
mean, we can talk. I think we can talk about that later too. But I
right.
think one last thing about this point on the difference between these one-party states and monarchies is that when most people think about tyranny, they're inclined to think about a single individual despot. But if you read Saint Thomas in his De Regno book, he wrote about another type of tyranny called factional tyranny. And factional tyranny it is where you have and it he says that factional tyranny evolves out of polyarchy, or the equal rule of multiple individuals or competing interests, which sounds a lot like modern democracies in a way. And
Right.
he
So it
says
sounds
that,
like one faction winning and crushing the other people in a tyrannical fashion.
yeah, basically, what happens, reason why factional tyranny is worse than a tyranny by like an individual is that the individual tyrant, he might rule in this kind of uh, uh, this he might rule in a despotic way, but he's mainly concerned about staying in power for its own sake, and so uh, he'll interfere with any action of the citizenry that will pose a threat to him. But once he's secure in his power, he will advance the common good, if only to facilitate his own power, and he'll rule more pragmatically. But a factional tyranny is typically concerned with securing power not for its own sake, but rather for advancing the interest of some group, like a group of ideologues or an economic class, a tribal faction or ethnic group, etc. And so when you have this kind of factional tyranny, they'll not only ignore the common good, they'll actively go against it, even after they've secured power, they'll still go against the common good of the people. And I
Yeah.
think this is very different from a monarchy, because a monarchy, as we stated before, the king is generally above these kinds of politics. So even the worst king, even the tyrant will act in the interests of the common good if it means it'll help secure his power better.
Right. Right. And on the point with the 20th century dictators, well, how did they get into the government? Well, they appealed to the demos and they led a revolution. And so that's kind of the validation of their power, is that the voice of the people rose up and gave them legitimacy. But what if that ends? Is there going to be another bloody revolution? I mean, that's kind of the problem with it, and that's the instability of these 20th century governments, where it's kind of like when democracy explodes, unfortunately. But
Mm,
just to put an addendum on the pros and cons, I just wanted to address one of the actual cons with monarchy, is that there is always a security problem with it. When you have the formalized leader and they're the actual head, and that's what's actually keeping the government afloat, then it becomes very important what happens to that figure throughout their life, that they're in good health, that they know who's going to succeed them well beforehand, and that there's basically intense security around them, keeping them safe from any threats. And that's the one big problem with it. It is kind of putting all your eggs in one basket, and you have to make sure that basket's safe. Um, but like you said, primogeniture monarchies get around this by having a clear tradition of inheritance and lineage. So that's usually solved, and that's something that's completely different from these makeshift 20th century dictatorships. Thank goodness, of course. So I would say that's the one problem with it. And but when you have one problem, it's easy to focus and overcome that single issue, as opposed to other forms of government that kind of have several cracks in the dam, and you have to continually put band-aids and tape and poke your holes in all the different things to keep the water from flowing out. But you know, so there we go.
I Yeah, I mean that's one thing. Um, I think we can move on to democracy, and I think I'd like to start with democracy by talking about how why was democracy ever implemented? How in both in times in Greece and modern times, and democracy, ironically, uh, yeah, this might come as a shock to some people, but democracy actually started out as a technology that developed in the wake of monarchy. Specifically, the kind of monarchy where they were concerned with primarily centralizing power because they wanted greater security for themselves. And this drive for security that you find in monarchies led to the rise of democracy, both in ancient Athens and in modern day, in the wake of the Enlightenment.
Oh, I see. So
Um,
they were kind of hedging their bets with it as a measure to kind of fill that security hole.
well, you see, so what you find is, back in ancient Greece, right? You had the what you had was the concentration of authority. All the authority was in the heads of different families called the eupatrids, and these family heads, were primarily concerned with the worship of the family's gods in the form of the family's fire hearth, and they passed down from son to son, father to son to son, uh, through primogeniture, their role as the head of the family and as the high priest in charge of the hearth. And the great now at this point, the king was the high priest. He was a figure that simply was the head of these family confederations. You know, there would be a bunch of families, and he'd be just the head. But he had to compete with these eupatrids a lot of the time. So, in order to centralize power, the king decided to appeal to the periphery, in this case, the Thetes. Now, the Thetes were basically a group people who were excluded from these powerful families and their worship, and they didn't have any kind of religion that they or worship that they could be a part of. And so the king was able to appeal to them by making them his. And by doing this, he was able to undermine the Eupatrids' authority. Now, while the Eupatrids did curb the power of the king, because they they didn't really get rid of this power. Instead, they did was take the king's place as the patron, and so they kept centralizing power into city states, uh, which undermined primogeniture. And eventually, we get to see the rise of the plebeians, who are just complete outsiders to this system. And then you see um, democracy, and then in out of these plebeians came these tyrants, and then from these tyrants you had these reforms by a guy named Solon, he created democracy. And the thing about democracy in that time was that it was insanely one key thing that it was good at was centralization. Democracy is so much better at centralizing power into smaller and smaller hands than a monarchy is, because the rulers are self-effacing, which means they're hidden. They can just endlessly appeal to the masses, and the masses will give them more power, and then they'll be able to use that power to radically change society however they want. And you know, if you have it, like, and and if your society is in need of radical change, this can have some benefits, but it's also incredibly destabilizing, because there's always the danger within democracy that the centralizers will forget that they are the rulers themselves. And this is arguably what happened in ancient Athens. And this is arguably what's happening now. Because modern democracies also started as a project of monarchs to centralize power by appealing to the masses. France, for instance, take King Louis XIV. You know, he's the archetypical absolute monarch. I am the state, he said. Well, what he did was, when the nobility were getting too uppity, he decided that he was tired of them trying to assassinate him. So after he won a big civil war against them, he basically demoted them and promoted a bunch of high educated commoners to positions of power as bureaucrats.
Well, yeah.
And
I mean,
then,
this dynamic has been around forever. It's basically high brings in low versus middle. So it's high and low versus middle, and that's always been around for eternity. Um, and of course, the problem is when it turns democratic, then it is kind of like a metastasizing cancer, and then that's the end of any absolute monarchy.
well, I
But
mean,
yeah.
yeah, I mean, Yeah, and I think that's the problem of absolute. I think the main con with absolute monarchy is that it easily devolves into democracy. And
Yeah.
I guess I think we can. I think we can move on to some of the cons that you've listed for democracy. I've talked long enough. Why don't you share some of your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I was just gonna say, when you were pointing out democracies are much better at centralizing power and they're much more totalitarian, it makes me think of the Hoppa pill, the Hoppian pill that, you know, libertarians never win their political outcomes because they don't attract power to themselves, and maybe monarchists are the true libertarians in the long-term historical trend, and your taxes aren't too high in a monarchy and they can't centralize and be totalitarian. So maybe they're the true libertarians, and it's why they always politically lose over time, and why it always decays into democracy. But that's kind of funny. But yeah, don't worry. There's many cons to democracy, so we can at least understand why it's morally worse, even if it's more effective at gaining power, because informal power is always more powerful than formal power, and that's just an unfortunate reality. But I mean, what do you take on this? Mass democracy is literally just bribing your supporters with your opponent's resources and power. What can you possibly say to that can refute that? That's basically what it is. It's just mass bribery. It's mass vanity. How do you deal with that?
I mean, there's a lot of I guess maybe if you were going to, I think the worst that a defender of democracy could do is point to monarchs like Louis XIV and say, "Aren't these the picture of vanity too?"
It's only the
But
vanity of one
it,
person and not your entire society, though. Fortunately,
exactly,
better one than literally
exactly.
every
So
person thinking, "My opinion matters. I matter. I decide how the state is run."
I mean,
Catastrophic.
this is part of the problem. I think that's part of the most dangerous part of democracy is that people forget that it's basically a centralizing technology used by rulers to centralize. When the rulers themselves buy their own bullshit about being for the people, they just keep centralizing, and then they keep propagating this vanity that everybody just believes, and that causes its own problems.
Yeah, I mean, that's really the crux of it, and why I actually hate it so much is that it's this kind of basic spiritual corruption that no other system can possibly produce in such an effective and widespread manner. Um, but to be clear about the bribery, I mean, how do you convince regular people? There's a large bell curve of aptitude and ability and intelligence, and if you're the doctor, you can't really offer them the vegetables. You kind of have to offer them the candy, and that's how it's going to be. And so it's, of course, there's going to be short-term gratification, and you can very easily pit them against the other partisans, because in a democracy, that's how people will always organize. They will organize into factions, and those factions will attack each other in a cold civil war, as we've discussed before. But not only is it bribing candy over vegetables, it's you can offer the destruction of the other faction that you hate. You can offer basically the pillaging and the looting of that other faction in order to redistribute it to your own faction, and that's completely fine to the democratic political leaders, because as long as their faction is happy, then they're happy and they remain in power. Unlike, kind of ironically, a monarchy where you kind of have to balance on top of all these factions over long term. You can't really just suppress. You can't really suppress the peasants as like the fifth estate. You can't ignore them forever, because eventually that will blow over. But that's just some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why, I mean, monarchies that don't do a good job of managing the peasants tend to become democracies. That's which really says. I think one of the things that about democracy that I think really you really highlighted, and it goes along with the bribery and the vanity, is that it's all the people in charge and have an incentive to basically give people what they want and ignore what they need. And I think this is clear even in the propaganda surrounding democracy. What is the propaganda surrounding especially liberal democracy? So you have a free market that gives the consumers whatever they want, and you have an electoral system that gives you whatever politicians you want. So it's it's essentially about giving you whatever you want, at least in a kind of rhetoric sense. Maybe it's not actual, because actual democracy is not really possible, as you've mentioned, but it it does seem like it encourages that kind of democratic mindset is all about the gratification of desire, even if it's not good for you.
Exactly. It and that's really about the ethos of democracy itself, or perhaps I could say the ethics of it, where and of course the free market in a way is not distinct from this, and that is just the gratification of people's desires, expressed desires, either economically or politically or both, because they're interlinked. So there's this kind of Overton window of utility, of material utility that defines democracies. And that's what it leans to over time. And of course, if you're like a religious traditionalist, you'd be very concerned about this, because people often replace the desire for creating a society that promotes people to be good and to be virtuous enough to go to heaven, and instead want to bring heaven on earth now, in order to satisfy all the voters and all the consumers. So that's really when it comes down to it for me. It's the spiritual problem with democracy that really hits the cake, and that's worse than Genghis Khan. That's worse than a lot of these 20th century people. That's basically worse than any other government. If you're corrupting the souls of your citizens, that's the last thing. That's the final goal, other than acquiring and maintaining sovereignty. But I don't know. That's just my
Yeah,
opinion.
I think your next point about democracy being a metastasizing cancer, and that every issue of civic life will be an opportunity for partisan power acquisition, is perhaps my least favorite part of democracy. And it happens in a variety of ways, but one of the most insidious ways it happens is how the ideas of freedom and equality invade every aspect of life, so that everything becomes about subjective rights, and the freedom to do this, and equality of opportunity, that and the part of the and the deal with that, what that really is, I mean, if you all you have to do is look back at history, like how did societies before today talk about freedom and equality? And what you find is that kings would often do this in order to undermine their rivals. They'd appeal to the masses in order to do this. And then but when kings did this, as soon as they were done beating up their rivals, or the nobility, once their power was secure, they kind of cut things off, because there was a rational plan behind it. It was kind of Machiavellian in a way, but there was a rationale behind this. Whereas in a democracy, most of the people who are behind the centralizing, even the people at the very top, the elites of the elites, the intellectuals, They don't recognize what they're doing half the time. And in fact, there's this kind of cognitive dissonance within them that we're going to be creating more freedom and equality. Oh no, we're centralizing. What should we do? Let's promote more freedom and equality. And that, but promoting freedom and equality leads to greater centralization, inevitably. And so what you end up is the state becoming more and more powerful while you have all these democratic actors promoting freedom and equality to counter the state and wondering why they are and then they're wondering why suddenly they have totalitarianism on their hands and they're like, wow, how did this happen?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, they won't leave you alone. I mean, to all those listening, your neighbor, your friend, your whatever, people in your social group, when they talk about these issues, they won't leave you alone, and it won't stop, and it'll just keep. They'll keep coming back. They'll keep reinforcing these ideas. They'll keep bringing them back up, even when you don't want to bring it up, even when you just want to play Monopoly or whatever. And that's the unfortunate thing about it, because it's such an easy tactic to use. But with the king, he's not gonna leave you. He's not gonna mess with you. Just get out of his way, and it'll be fine. But let's maybe chew on a couple of the historical examples. Um, it's difficult where to start. Perhaps we can go from the English monarchy. How did we get from Elizabeth I, who was like an actual monarch, to Elizabeth II, who is like a nice old lady that they take pictures of sometimes?
Well, we have to first understand that the English monarch, I mean, Elizabeth the First, and we have to ask the question first off: was Elizabeth the First a monarch in the absolute sense? Because you get the impression that England was always kind of a stick. There was always a kind of oddity with England because they're noble. Like ever going back to even the Magna Carta, the king had a difficult time. Had a difficult time, uh, sort of centralizing power to himself. Uh, and I think this the kind of what do you have to say as a monarch about the idea of the Magna Carta? What do you have to say about that?
Well, it's just, I mean, I really hate these legal documents, and that I understand, common law is great and everything, but the Magna Carta doesn't matter. All that matters is, am I the current ruler, and how much power do I have? And does that mean the nobility is going to have a big say, or are they not really going to have a say? And that's that. It's, you can have this like legal tradition and this basic principle of, no, the nobility is going to have a say in the English monarchy, and you can pretend that. But if someone comes along and successfully centralizes power and kind of ignores the nobility, then that's that. Generally, I think the only way for this kind of structure to work without it eventually going south, and although with the Magna Carta, it would take quite a long for it to expand beyond that and expand to the masses. But the only way that monarchy really works is if it's the absolute leader and it's actually just centralized in that one person. And that's basically one of the problems. Essentially, is security, and then it's the monarch actually successfully centralizing power to themselves, as opposed to these other systems which sometimes do it more seamlessly. With
Mm.
oligarchies, oligarchies are more stable, like we would say, but you need that singular leader in order for it to maintain the actual traditional culture and all those other things, all those other benefits from it, because oligarchs will turn to factions again, and then we have basically that democratic problem all over again.
Right. And so the I mean the idea of the Magna Carta was the idea what was that there were a bunch of barons that were trying to a bunch of barons that did not like the current king, and the and although there are people who would say that that the Magna Carta was just trying to reinstate the traditional English freedoms in the traditional Anglo-Saxon constitution that was overthrown by the Norman invasion of 1066, and Magna Carta was just trying to bring that older system back. And I think, but I think that what you find with the Magna Carta is a what you find with the Magna Carta is a justification for uh, this kind of uh, this kind of idea that it's better for the monarch to have his power limited by a written constitution or an unwritten constitution, and the idea and that kind of and I think that kind of thinking led to is led to I think the more important thing maybe is to talk about parliament. I mean, there was such a thing as parliament back in Elizabeth the First's day, right?
Yeah, the English monarchy is probably. It's unfortunate that the globe was taken over and became the Anglosphere, because these kinds of political traditions are incoherent. I remember clearly in civics class, we kind of began with the Magna Carta, because the Magna Carta, although we could reduce it to the self interests of the barons, of the nobility of the time, it is the beginning of this mythos of supposedly limited government and constitutional government. Now, England had a parliament for quite a long time before it became mass democracy, but any of these impositions of, oh, there's a limited government, oh, there's a constitution that we maintain allegiance to, that puts into conflict and is suppressant of the monarch itself. Is the monarch ruling, or are we going by constitutional principles that were written down before? If it's the latter, then the monarch isn't truly ruling, and it's a legal tradition ruling. Is there such a thing as limited government? Well, no. It's whoever is the sovereign, and if they are the sovereign, they'll decide if they follow this constitution or not, and it doesn't really matter. But with England, they begin with that. They introduce that mythos into the modern political tradition, and so eventually, even worse than the other supposedly enlightened monarchs of the 18th and 19th centuries, it really probably was one of the first ones to go in the modern age.
What I'm seeing here, if I remember correctly, Parliament was originally created after the Norman invasion because there were these because the king had a hard time ruling without the support of the nobility and the clergy, which is how the Magna Carta was would eventually be implemented. So you had these great councils that were made up of the high-ranking nobility and the high-ranking church officials that served with that served as sort of the consultants, these consultants to the king. But and whenever their relationship was bad, the entire government seemed to break down because the monarch, the English monarchy, had a hard time centralizing. So there was always this constant back and forth between the monarchy, the nobility, and the church. And whenever the uh, whenever you have and then you have this kind of uh, this parliament over time would slowly but surely erode the power of the monarchy. You know, first getting rid of absolute monarchy, and then slowly reducing the monarch to a figurehead. I mean, the by the time of Edward, you had Edward the First in 1272, who uh, who he had so Eh, at that point, Parliament was firmly established as an institution, formally established as an institution of government, besides the king. And then you had the rise of these kinds of Tudor monarchs, you know, Henry the Seventh, and Henry the Seventh, for instance. And while these monarchs were very powerful, uh, uh, these monarchs were very powerful, but the Tudor monarchs would often appeal to Parliament to legitimize their decisions. So, and I think that's what happened with. Uh, by the time you had Elizabeth the First, you would have uh, the Elizabeth, or whoever Tudor was there. They would appeal to they would appeal to the person in charge and have them do things. I think in the 17th century we really started to see the kind of destruction of this kind of English balance of power. What with Parliament being taken over by Puritans. You know, you had the Long Parliament, you had the Oliver Cromwell, and you also had the Glorious Revolution by the end of that century.
Oh yeah, those Puritans, those Congregationalists. Oh, those low church Protestants, anti-clerical Protestants. Nothing to do with democratic revolutions in the democratic age. Nothing to do with that. But let's bring in other historical examples. So an interesting thing to pit against each other is to compare, modern revolutions like the French and American Revolution with perhaps Chinese dynasties, because we have the Han Dynasty, we have the Qin Dynasty, we have these several dynasties that last for centuries and centuries, and Chinese society basically doesn't change for long, long, long amounts of time, and that's partly because of how Chinese society is. It's a very naturally orderly society, perhaps because of the Chinese themselves, but it's probably also because of these long dynastic traditions that they had. It's definitely a different theory of power than the divine right European monarchs. They kind of have this mandate of heaven. They basically are legitimate because they establish order. Um, Kind of like Qin Shi Huang coming out of the Warring States period, where China had a period of instability, and the Qin dynasty successfully won out in that period. Um, so they kind of have a different theory of power to support their legitimacy, but nonetheless, these dynasties and the European monarchies, society would rarely change really over even centuries times. But when we compare this to the French Revolution, to what Yugoslavia, to the Revolution in Russia, these are dramatic and almost climactic changes in society, consistent upheaval. Democracy and revolution kind of go hand in hand because it's kind of the voice of the people crying out, this grassroots movement to change things. So, in general, we see this kind of historical difference between monarchies being about stasis, stability, and not change, tradition, and democracies being about change. I mean, even if you think in our kind of tacky, exhausted, stale late stage democracy in America, Obama, it's all about change, and even the right wing politicians appeal to that change idea. And that's probably because if you have these factions in a democracy, you're going to have you're going to have the opposition saber rattling outside of power, and they have to offer something new and fresh in order to basically successfully overturn the current administration. So there's always an incentive to bring in new changes, to encourage new policy, new ideas, all that kind of stuff. So democracy is this kind of churn of endless revolution when monarchies are an eternal tradition, and I think that would tie it up quite nicely. But I mean, do you agree with that? I mean, it seems other than mono-ethnic, monocultural democracies, these democracies are quickly changing and shifting over time. Make sure
Yeah,
to yeah.
I would agree with that. I think that change, yeah, I mean, like I said before, and I think like I said before, democracies are excellent at centralization because of their leaders' ability to accumulate informal power, and 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 because of their tendency to and because of the natural tendencies of the factions that developed within democracies, this kind of polyarchy that develops, you end up with a bunch of factions that are all trying to radically change society. And usually these radical changes are described with hyper moralistic terms, but really it's all about fulfilling the desires of their constituents and trying to just give them whatever they want so that the politicians get more votes.
Yeah, it's whatever will increase their support. So they can even encourage their supporters to emphatically support them, to become slavishly dependent on them. You can see post FDR and post LBJ, there's basically this slavish underclass of people that live in these feudal colonies called the projects that are dependent on food stamps and these kinds of checks. And that's not to be a boomer con and just diss them. And it's like, oh, you're money grubbing and you're dependent on the government and you're a slob and lazy or whatever. These people are basically serfs now, and what are we going to do about it? They're just basically dependent, and they will very emphatically support whoever will maintain their survival. It's an almost desperate thing, and I think it's very unfortunate. And then on the other side of this, um, they can encourage supporters to develop a religious, like a near religious zealotry for their movement and their position. And when you do that, as opposed to a central, uniting traditional religion that everyone follows, you're going to always encourage this new religious factionalism that will encourage supporters to more emphatically support your side and to increasingly demonize the other religious faction. And that's really the problem here.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'd like to ask about this, and this goes to the whole relationship between democracy and socialism. What would you have to say about the historical connection or the logical connection between democracy and socialism? Is there is there a logical connection there? Is there a
Oh,
historical
there's all
connection? Is
kinds
there
of
both?
yeah, it's both in all actually, because let me try from just the from at the intellectual level. You know how you're talking about democracies are very good at centralizing power in a way.
Yeah.
Well, of course, you're bribing your supporters. Well, with what resources? You're bribing it with your opponent's resources. Um, you can basically offer them to nationalize an industry that's full of supporters, um, and basically benefit that specific industry and the people in that industry. So you see this over time. If you continually bribe your supporters with your opponent's resources, and if you continually centralize power, well, you can see where this goes. It's going to naturally lead to more nationalization, more redistribution, and eventually, at a certain point, the state controls most of the economy in that sense. And I mean, the distinction between social democracy, democratic socialism, and just full socialism at that point is lost on me. It eventually slides in that direction because you can continually offer new spoils, new domains to offer to your supporters. One of the obvious examples of this is the issue of healthcare. If there's such a large amount of have-nots on healthcare, and if the problem gets worse and worse, as in people not being able to afford certain types of healthcare, or there's some kind of resentment at the upper class of people that get all this elective care, well, they can justify nationalizing it. Well, if they can nationalize it for that reason, they could nationalize the railroads, as some people want in Britain. They could nationalizing many food services. So you see this always goes along because one of the teams in politics, in democratic politics, obviously, the left really likes that strategy of high plus low versus middle, and in democracies, it's this kind of bio-Leninist thing where they collect together the unwashed masses and give them bread and circuses. So if you continually do that and appeal to those unwashed masses, you'll bribe them with entirely centralized power that you're offering them. So in a short way, that's kind of how it slides towards socialism. But historically, you can see in America and all these other countries how the bureaucracies get bigger, the welfare state gets bigger, more industries are nationalized over time. We can see just from the clear historical evidence that naturally the trend is towards increasing intervention in the economy and in all walks of life, and that's basically, you could call that a socialist state, you could call that a totalitarian state. It doesn't really matter to me, but that's where it's going to lead to.
Right, right. So I think that with that, I'd say that maybe we could talk about a little bit about the kind of 20th century liberal democracies and how they might and how and how they are in a lot of ways symbolic of what democracy of the essence of democracy, despite what some socialists might say, because some socialists would say that liberal democracy isn't true democracy because you're not fulfilling the promise of democracy to bring equality to the masses.
Exactly. That's the fundamental assumption of democracy. Um, if if people are equal, then we can give them an equal say in the political results of a state, an equal political say, one vote per person. It goes in hand in hand. It's naturally egalitarian, and if you're going to democratize politics, why not democratize the workplace? Why not democratize this industry? You see lots of the socialists talk in that language because that's the fundamental ethos of democracy. It's this commitment to equality. So we might like to think it's freedom versus equality, but it's naturally going to shift towards equality over time, unless it explodes and goes in a different direction. So
I mean,
yeah,
I'd argue that freedom and equality are two ways of speaking about something similar. Because if we think about what is freedom but the freedom to fulfill one's desires, and what is equality but getting power from your enemies so that getting power and resources from your enemies so that you can fulfill your desires. Isn't that these two terms seem to be moving towards the same thing? At least if we're talking about freedom and equality in the sense that we take them to mean in. the average democracy.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and it's kind of in the vein of when you hear when you hear a very progressive person talking about we need a right to this thing. I need a right. I need a right to this thing. This thing is a human right, and it's some kind of new novel thing that we haven't heard before. Maybe not like freedom of speech or bearing arms or all that kind of stuff. What they could essentially be saying there is, oh, I want this right. I want to be free to do this thing. But it could also just mean I want this power, and I see that other people have that power. I want everyone should have a right to that kind of power, including me, because I don't have it right now. So, in one sense, you can look at it cynically as saying they're just more power for me and not for thee. And the other sense, it's this idealistic, increasing desire for equality along all these planes.
All right.
All right,
So
so I'm gonna
what
wrap it
I
up.
mean,
Um, if we look on one side, we see monarchies, this low time preference, long term governance. Monarch is balancing themselves above several different factions, trying to unite a country around a traditional religious culture, and hopefully resist any kind of upheaval uh, in promotion of long term stability and good quality citizens. It's on the side of good. Now, on the other side, we see democracy, where it's consistently allowing people to gratify themselves, to make them feel powerful. My opinion matters. I am the voter that decides how the state is run. It encourages increasing division as people separate into factions, and it will always encourage the opposition to produce new, progressive, changing policies. Short-term preference, because short-term time preference, because the government can switch between administration and between different administrations consistently. So there's this naturally progressive and anti-traditional ethos to it. It naturally rips apart and gratifies their citizens with this poisonous vanity. It's the side of evil. So we've got good and evil. That's all that it is. That's that. So thank you all for watching. I hope you learned a bit about monarchy versus democracy. And thank you so much, GeoCon, for coming on.
well, I'm glad to have come on, and I hope that uh, for any of my viewers who might be watching this, I'll be posting this video onto my channel, and the link to 21st Reactions channel will be in the description. Thank you for watching.
All right, remember monarchy, the side of good, democracy, the side of evil. Have a good one, everyone. Grazia prima.